How's it going, everybody? My name is Lee Woodmansee, and I'm the campus minister here at the Baptist Collegiate Ministry at the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith. Right now, you are watching session 3 of our Connect Group material that we're walking through for the fall of 2020. So if you have been joining us, you know that there's some homework that you have to do before you actually watch this video, and you should have seen at the very beginning the title card that we had, your homework for reading those 2 chapters in Genesis. So if you hadn't done that, go ahead and just pause the video, go read those 2 chapters, then come back and watch the video. That way, contextually, all of this actually makes sense for us. So, I am joined by a very special guest for us today, and I'm going to introduce her in just a moment. But first, I just want you to know that we're going to be talking about 2 very fascinating people in the narrative of Genesis. And this is one of those stories that, frankly, if we don't know what to do with it in context, it can be pretty perplexing as to like the story as a whole, what we're supposed to do with it. And so we're going to be looking at Leah and Rachel today. And so hopefully our goal for today will be achieved of understanding narratively what's going on in context, but also getting a better sense of what we're supposed to do with this information. And that's kind of the hope as we're looking at these women through the Bible. So if you haven't read those chapters, go back and do that. We'll be good to go. So, on to our guest. The formal introduction that I want to give for her is something that I'm pleased to do because she is an amazing woman that I've had the chance of knowing for 15 years. She is a 2-time graduate from the University of Arkansas, and she is a 1-time graduate from the University of Louisville, and subsequently is literally the most... the smartest, that might be a better way to say it, the smartest woman that I know. She is presently she is an educator. She teaches high school math in Alma High School. She has 3 children, and she also just so happens to be my first wife, and that is Kacie Woodmansee. How are you?
First wife. Last wife.
Last wife.
Want to murder you?
Murder me, yeah.
Murder you?
First wife, only wife.
Yeah, only wife. Yeah, I'm good.
Rock on. Did I miss anything there? Anything else you want to add? That the mother of 3 are our children? Maybe that's something to clarify?
Yeah.
Okay.
You tricked me into marrying you. That ties into the theme for today.
That's a fact, yeah. So, I mean, tricking and that kind of jazz. All right, rock on. Well, love, what are we talking about today?
Rachel and Leah.
Excellent. Let's just give a little bit of context. Why did I ask you to be the one to work through Leah and Rachel for us today?
If you are allowed to have a least favorite Bible story, this would be my least favorite Bible story. I don't know if that I can admit that, but...
Well, you just did.
I said if you're allowed to.
Well, okay. But
so it may not be.
Okay. So, but as we are right now...
It's my least favorite
It's
Bible
your least
story.
favorite Bible story. So, but why is it that I had you be the one to talk about this?
Because you're mean. I mean, I guess
Fact.
Partly because I've thought about it so much. To not like it, I have to have kind of thought about it, and there's a lot of emotion invoked when thinking about this story. Probably for a lot of people, but for me, and so I think it was good for me to kind of think through some of that and to kind of figure out, what are we supposed to do with that emotion? What do we do with that? So.
Excellent. Well, since you teased it out a little bit, how about you give us a little bit of a rundown of the actual narrative itself?
Okay, so I think for this one you have to start back in, I think it's Genesis 25, where basically Jacob is born. So Rebecca is not able to have kids, so they pray to God, and God tells Rebecca that she'll have twins. They'll both be the fathers of nations, but that the older will serve the younger, which is probably surprising for her. And so she has Esau and Jacob is born holding Esau's heel, which sounds really uncomfortable. But the name Jacob means, or can mean, he cheats. And so, I mean, already from the beginning, he's off to a rocky start. But we also see in, I think it's that chapter, as they get older, as they grow up, that Esau sells his birthright for a bowl of stew, which doesn't sound that great. Like, I can
Must
imagine...
have been some great grub, right?
I can imagine like our 3-year-old selling something for, a bowl of spaghetti or something like that. But no, Esau, a grown man, sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. And so Jacob took advantage of him there. And then we see in chapter 27 that Jacob tricks Esau again. So he's living up to the name, where food is again in play here. He basically steals Esau his birthright or his blessing. And so, Jacob pretends to be Esau because Isaac doesn't see very well, so he feels the fake goat's hair or whatever it is on his arm, and thinks that it is Esau. And so Jacob steals his blessing. So he is now going to be, the one that is in the lineage of the great nation that Abraham was promised.
The prominent figure of the two.
Right. And so, understandably, Jacob is afraid that Esau is going to, murder him. And so he runs away, and he runs to Rebekah's family. He runs to Laban. And we pick that up a little bit later after some weird dreams that Jacob has, where Jacob meets Laban. Well, he meets Rebekah first, or he meets Rachel first, and then he meets Laban. And so he works for Laban for about a month. And Laban's like, well, I should probably pay you since you're doing all this work for me. That seems pretty reasonable. And so for the payment, Jacob asks for Rachel's hand in marriage. And so he's like, well, you're going to have to, I'll work 7 years for that, which, that's a lot. But he works for 7 years.
We dated for how long?
A year and a half. That's not like 7. I don't know if I would have waited 7 years for you. But he works for 7 years. It comes to, time. He's like, okay, I worked my 7 years. I'm going to marry Rachel now. Well, it was dark, or she was wearing a veil or something. Who really knows? But gets married, but it's not Rachel. It's Leah. Surprise, right? And so he's pretty upset about that afterwards. And Laban's like, well, that's not how we do it around here. You're supposed to marry the older one first. And Jacob, being the supremely intelligent man that he is like, well, just give me Rachel too. She's the one that I love, so I'll work for her as well. So he gets married to Rachel as well and works for 7 more years. But it says that he loved Rachel more than Leah. And so we see previously that, Rachel was beautiful in form and in figure. And then Leah was not quite as so. We don't really know exactly what it means that it says that, she had weak eyes. It could be she couldn't see very well. It could be that you didn't want to look at her. It could be, she just had, soft eyes, whatever. But regardless, she wasn't as beautiful as Rachel, and Jacob loved Rachel more. A little superficial, if you ask me. But continuing on there, because he's married to both these women, and that's never a good idea, Leah recognizes that she is not loved as much as Rachel, and so she cries out to God. And God hears her cries, and he opens her womb, and he gives her 4 children, 4 boys. Reuben, which means see, a son. So she's like, hey, Jacob, look, see, I gave you a son. You should love me now. And then there's Simeon, which means heard, right? So God has heard me, so you should probably hear me too. And he doesn't. And then Levi, which means attached. So now hoping that Jacob will be attached to her because she has now given him 3 sons. And then we get to Judah, which means praise. So she's praising God for these children that he's given her. And it's a long narrative. Keep going. Rachel gets jealous and basically blames Jacob and is like, hey, I don't have these kids. I feel like I'm just going to die, right? If you don't give me kids, I'm going to die. So instead of, that happening, she basically like, well, instead of that, I'm going to give you Bilhah, which is my maidservant, and they have kids. And so she births Dan, and Rachel names him that, and that means judged because she's feeling a little guilty for, circumventing what God's plan was. And then Naphtali means wrestling because there's just a bit of wrestling going on in that family. And then Leah gets upset because she's not having any more kids, so she gives Jacob Zilpah, or however it is, and then that they have Gad, which means fortune, and Asher, which means happy. So she's pretty pleased with herself and her situation at that point. And then it carries on, and they've got these kids, and at one point, basically Rachel trades time with Jacob for some mandrakes, because that isn't strange. And so Leah has 3 more children, 2 boys, Issachar, which means for hire, because basically she hired out Jacob's services. Can I say that? That's probably wrong. And then Zebulun, which means honor. And then she has a daughter named Dinah, which comes into play a little bit later. But and then God sees Rachel's pain. And so Rachel is upset because she has not had any children at this point. She has Jacob's love, but she doesn't have any children. And so God blesses her with Joseph, meaning may he add, because she wants more. And so she's basically asking God to add more children onto that. At that point, I think Jacob had been with Laban for about, I think it was like 20, 22 years, something like that. And he's like, well, it's time for me to go back home to my family. Laban doesn't really want to let him go, so he kind of makes a deal with him, but God blesses Joseph and, allows him to basically accumulate all these things. And then he tricks Laban into leaving. So he runs off without telling him, and then Laban catches up to him, all this kind of stuff. Okay. There's all this stuff in between. But moving back to Rachel and Leah, on the road, Esau comes. Jacob's afraid that Esau is going to, murder him. And so he basically just kind of sends the least important people out front. So the servants go first, the two maidservants and their kids, and then Leah and her six, children, 6 boys and a girl. There may be more girls, I don't know. And then Rachel and Joseph are right by him. And so he is even now putting prominence on Rachel and her son. But Esau doesn't kill her, or doesn't kill them. It all works out. There's some stuff that goes on with Dinah. We're not going to worry about that right now. But then Rachel gets pregnant again, but she dies in childbirth this time. So she has Benjamin, which means the son of the right hand. And so she dies in childbirth. But I think even then the story can continue on because we see just the effects of Jacob's favoritism towards Rachel played out in favoritism towards her children. of Joseph and Benjamin, and most people are probably familiar with that story.
And that's basically the rest of Genesis at that point.
Right. And so, he's upset that Rachel has died, understandably so, but then he just transfers all that affection to her children, and poor Leah's
Still there. So with that synopsis out of the way, let's kind of recount what are the oddities of this narrative. So one, just Jacob and Esau, and just the nature of their birth. Then you've got the fact that Jacob is an absolute trickster. And then you have this upheaval of how the marriage order is going to work between Leah and Rachel, and Laban has now tricked him. And then you've got all the maidservants. Like, what am I missing about the oddities of this story other than the emotional connectedness that we have there?
I think one thing to point out is we like to read stories and we like to be like, see, okay, what can I learn from this particular person? We see these heroes of the faith. Jacob is a forefather of the faith. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he's always mentioned. But in this story, you don't see him doing a whole lot right. Not by anybody, but you don't necessarily see anybody doing a whole lot right. And so I think that's kind of hard for us. We want to read, and that's maybe one of the reasons we don't like it, is we want to read a story, kind of see ourselves in the characters, and then see, okay, what can I gain from this? What can I learn about how I can act? But there's just not a whole lot to recommend most of these characters, at least not in this particular story. Jacob is still incredibly blessed by God at every turn, which is frustrating sometimes when you're reading it. It's like, he messed up. Why is he still, getting all these blessings? He has the dream on his way to Laban, and he wrestles with God on the way back, and he's getting blessed, with stuff. But other than that, there's not a whole lot from these characters that you're like, yes, I need to emulate that particular characteristic.
So when we come back around to it, I think just an honest accounting of how we're supposed to read Old Testament is the difference between prescriptive and descriptive. Can you explain what the difference between those two things are for us?
Yeah, so narrative is going to be descriptive in a vast majority of the cases, and so it just kind of tells you information. It doesn't necessarily always cast judgment on people's actions, at least not explicitly.
There's not this editorializing.
Right, so it's not like, okay, Jacob did this thing and it was wrong, and then the narrator pulls back and is like, and these were the consequences, or this is why this is wrong and you shouldn't do this. Even with marrying more than one person, that is not God's original design for marriage, but you don't see at any point in there that it said, this is wrong, you should not have done this, but you do see a lot of negative consequences every time that it happens. So descriptive is just going to be telling of information, and then prescriptive is obviously prescribing something. You do this. Okay, these are the things that you should do. And that's a lot of the New Testament and a lot of the Old Testament. There is some of that in there, but a lot of it is the narrative, and so it's going to be more descriptive. And so you can't necessarily, you have to dig a little deeper to pull out some of those things.
Gotcha. So with all of that recap out of the way, we've kind of nailed down, there's these oddities of the narrative. We're not supposed to emulate these characters at every turn. Frankly, hardly any of them, if we're going to be really honest in many ways. what are we supposed to do with this then? Like, what is it that we are supposed to learn from this text? If we're studying Leah and Rachel and we're looking at women through the Bible, where's the value in taking a hard look at Leah and Rachel? What is it that we're supposed to learn from this?
And I think with a lot of narrative, and it's something people don't necessarily like, is they like thinking of the Bible as a guidebook for life. And you, like what you were talking about with the descriptive, that's just not always going to work. And so one of the things that you always look for, I mean, two things you always look for is what is the character of God? What do we learn about God from this story? And then the other that you would always look at is how does this lead us to Jesus? And I think you can very clearly see both of those things here. I mean, in terms of Leah and Rachel, being women and studying women of the Bible specifically, I mean, the biggest thing that we see is the lineage, is their children, is the results of this, right? And so we see not only God's blessing in the short, term with giving children, but the results of that later on, and it's Leah from whom the priests come from the Levites, and then it's also Leah where where Jesus comes from the tribe of Judah. And so as women, we've been given the in the vein of Eve, the opportunity to be mothers, and whether that is physical mothers, like having children, or adoption, or just being a mother figure to someone. I mean, a big part of the turmoil in this story is that they wanted to be mothers. Leah looked to motherhood to find her affirmation, since she wasn't getting it from Jacob.
And desperately wanted it, even naming her kids in such a way.
Yes, and then Rachel was feeling bereft. She was upset because she didn't have children, so she felt, and part of it is just the time of, like, if you're a woman and you didn't have kids, what good are you, right? And so even though that she was loved by Jacob, she didn't feel loved in general because she didn't have any kids, and she needed that to affirm who she was as a woman. And then when we take a step back from that, we see, yes, there is a lot that comes from the children that they have, but not all women are called to have children biologically. And so just learning about what it is to be a woman is not necessarily just having children, it's glorifying God and where he's placed you, and they weren't necessarily able to do that. They weren't doing that, and so, at
least not in the way they expected,
right,
or really anticipated,
or the way that we see it, as written in Scripture. And so I think if we're just looking at them as women, yes, their children are a big part of that, but how they handled the situation up till that point kind of gives us an insight into who they were. And so I think there's benefit, like I said, in looking at who God is through this story, and then looking at how it leads us to Jesus. But as far as like what we're supposed to learn from them as women, I think it's more of our relationship with God than it is even with a relationship with a spouse or with kids, because they don't set a good example for that.
Right. And so I think we would have to be honest to say that, like, there is some redeeming qualities about how the marriages did play out, even though that is not exactly how God designed marriage to be functioning, period. But we would have to say that, like, the blessing to Israel, the nation, is constituted through these, frankly, 4 women and Jacob. Can you go a little bit deeper into, like, how we actually explore what it is how God is blessing them through that, and what it is that we learn about him, not just in the fact that he has created women in this vein to be able to bear children and fulfill the cultural mandate that we've talked about in the previous 2 sessions, but, like, what's the next step beyond that for us? Are we just to say, oh, God works in weird ways, and just write it off at that? Like, is that how we understand this?
I think part of it is we expect to see blessing immediately, and that's not always going to be the case. Rachel died having Benjamin, so she's not going to even see what Joseph does with his life. He's not perfect either, but she doesn't see that whole scenario play itself out. And then for Leah, she lives a little bit longer, but and she, I think, knows because of the promises that God gave Abraham and gives Jacob later on. But she doesn't really get to see Jesus, obviously. And so part of it is we have to trust that God knows more than we do. And that's hard sometimes because we immediately want to see the results of God's blessing. And that's just not necessarily always how it works. And it's hard for me, and it's probably the small feminist in me that comes out when a woman is known best for either who she's married to or her kids. Because you also have stories in the Bible where, it's the woman's actions that are the thing that gets her to be well known. And that's just the selfish, sinful part of me, because I want my actions to be what gets me to be known by others, as opposed to, who I am connected with. But more importantly, like, it's my relationship with God. It's my being a child of God. That is the most important thing here. And then you see this in this story. It is not about what Rachel or Leah do. It's not about them. He doesn't bless them because of who they are, of what they do, any more than he blessed Jacob or Isaac or even Abraham. It wasn't based on necessarily what they did, but it's about who he is as the sovereign and loving God. And so we see that connection there. And so one of the things that it kind of leads me to is that relationship trumps everything. Mm-hmm. It's hard for us when we read in the New Testament that we're supposed to basically hate everybody else in comparison to how much we love God. So we don't hate people, because we're not supposed to do that either, but we're supposed to love God so much and seek everything from him, that when I'm not being loved by who I think should love me, that I can turn to him, because he's the one that always loves me. And if I'm not fulfilling what I think the calling is in the way that I expect it to, whether that's in a career or having children or whatever, that's not turning out the way that I expect it to, that doesn't mean that God's plan is wrong or flawed. And it doesn't mean that he doesn't love me or care for me, because that I, in my feeble, minded, self doesn't quite understand his plan, that I know that he loves me. And that's a hard thing to grasp onto. It's easier to grasp onto the physical, tangible things, like a spouse that we feel we've been promised, or kids that we feel that we've been promised, or a career, or whatever it is, the people that we can see around us. But we have to take a step back and kind of recognize who we are in Christ, and realize that his love surpasses everything that we could ever imagine.
Gotcha. So, I mean, you've kind of detailed there, like, this pursuit of knowing God better in the light of this weird narrative at times. But let's now make the connection to Christ, like how we are to understand our relationship to him better. Practically, how do we get from here to Jesus, just from reading the text and knowing the narrative? What would you say about putting those pieces together? Because if we're going to try to make that next leap, for some folks, it may not be all that apparent.
Right. I think there's two ways that you make the leap to Jesus. One is just in the general redemption story. So everything that Jacob does and messes up, God redeems.
Which is numerous.
Yes, it's a lot. And even the same for Rachel and Leah. Every time that they mess up, God redeems that situation. And like I said, not necessarily in ways they can immediately see, but God isn't like, hey, I'm going to start over. I chose wrong. We're going to go back to Esau and go through that route. Like, he still continues on with his promises. And so the whole Old Testament is just full of redemption stories. And some of them are more obvious than others. Some you're going to have to read more than a verse or even a chapter to see that redemption. And a big part of that is the story with Rachel and Leah. And so, we see that redemption, not even just the one that comes, that we can see, okay, we see some redemption through Joseph and his people, and
literally saves the nation.
He saves the nation, and then carrying on the line there. But like I mentioned before, Jesus comes from Leah's lineage, and so the one that was unloved, the one that was basically hated, God fulfilled his promise. I mean, he makes a promise to Jacob, but it is through Leah that he does that. Mm-hmm. And so it's a direct connection there with, that's where Jesus comes from. He is the promised redeemer, and he is the one that takes all of our mistakes, because it's easy to look at these stories and you're like, wow, that was dumb. Why did you do that? And it's a lot harder to recognize those things in ourselves, even though we do it literally every day. We may not be selling birthrights for a bowl of stew or whatever, or marrying multiple people, right?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. First wife. Yep. But we're still constantly making mistakes, and it's Jesus who redeems us. It is not ourselves and not anything that we can do. And so we see that in the lives of Rachel and Leah and Jacob, and then we see it with the birth of Jesus.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to push the thought too far, but to say that Jesus from the lineage of Judah is not just from Leah, but that's the first wife. I mean, like in proper context there, I don't want to push that thought too far, but I think that's something that's worth mentioning of like, God has his designs for how he is going to redemptively work through history and reveal himself, in different ways throughout this progressive revelation of who he is through the scriptures. But I mean, I feel like that's something that at least bears mentioning. What else would you want to say about this before we kind of move to our last big question if you've got anything?
Another big characteristic of God that I think we see from this is just he's truth. He is true. He is not the trickster. He is not the deceiver. So when we see Jacob, that his whole life is basically defined by that, if you're only looking at his actions. And he gets that from a lineage of deceivers.
Even Abraham was
Abraham deceives twice about saying his wife is his sister. Isaac does literally the same thing. And so there's this whole idea of like, okay, I'm not getting what I want, so I'm just going to deceive people. I'm going to trick them out of it. And we see that multiple times through Jacob. And then it happens to him, and he's a little upset about it, but he does not learn his lesson because then he tricks Laban later on,
getting his goats,
and so like we see that in society and culture, in humans, we lie. I mean, we see it in our kids, right? They don't get what they want, or
Your
they think
kids
they're
lie.
going to get.
Mine don't.
My kids lie a lot. They don't get what they want, and so they lie about it. And it's a dumb lie, and you can see right through it, and it's not even going to be helpful for them, but it is our natural reaction. And then we have to compare that to our ultimate comparison, which is God. And we see throughout this that God said that he was going to do this, and he does it. It may be a little painful for the people along the way because of their mistakes, but if you compare our sinful nature to who God is as our one source of truth, then we can't help but see all the times that God has done what he says that he has done or that he would do. And we look at our culture today, and there's no such thing as truth. You can't know truth.
It's all relative.
It's all relative. And your truth is truth for you, unless it interferes with my truth, and then you're wrong, right? So that falls apart so easily. But God is our one source of truth, and if we're looking to God for truth every single time, we're going to find it there. And so I think that's a big thing that you can pull out of this story, is that even though everybody in this story deceives and lies and messes up, God never does. And there may be judgments for that along the way, but God still continues to keep his promises.
Gotcha. Well, I want to return for our last question that I have for us, basically where we started with, why did I want you to be the one to talk about this text? And I just want to ask a question this way. Like, this narrative is so emotionally driven. Like, we should see, frankly, Jacob gets deceived. Like, we should square with that. Jacob is deceived by Laban. But he kind of had it coming, right? It's kind of what we see. Like, that's just the nature of all of us at some level. So I don't put too much stock there, but the deep emotional nature of Leah and Rachel, and how one is loved, explicitly said to be loved, and the other one is, tolerated, maybe might be the better way to kind of think about it. Here's the question. How much should we let those elements that are emotionally charged, how much should we let that drive us or influence in how we interpret this narrative? How much should that really bear on us as we read this?
I mean, I think you have to recognize that emotions can be deceiving, and you can't always rely on those, but I think God gives us emotions for a reason, and it's to connect to him. And so, the big emotion, I can't speak for dudes, and I can't speak for all females.
I'll speak for all dudes.
Okay, that'll work. But when I read this story, my thought is I have felt unloved too. Like, there are times when I felt like someone should care for me more than they do, and they don't, or that nobody cares for me. I'm seeking affirmation from, a boy or whatever growing up in high school or whatever it is, and I have felt unloved. And so you see that in these characters, but you can't stop there. You can't leave that emotion where it's at and then just kind of sink into that, because Leah's not unloved. Mm-hmm. She's unloved by Jacob, but she's not unloved by God. And so do use those emotions that God gives you. I don't think you should read any scripture and not feel anything. Like that to me makes me think that you're not seeing it as something that actually happened. It's not about real people. It's not about a real God. Like you have to feel something when you're reading it, otherwise you're not really reading it, I don't think. And so when you feel that connection there, like, I have been unloved before, or at least felt like I've been unloved before, make that connection and then allow it to drive you to God, because that's what Leah did, and she had to be reminded.
She works it out in real life.
She had to be reminded. And one of the things, I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but by the time she gets to, what's the fourth one? Judah, right? Every time for the first 3 children, she's like, well, maybe now Jacob will love me. Maybe now he'll pay attention to me. By the time she gets to Judah, she's like, because God has blessed me. Mm-hmm. And there's no mention of Jacob at all. And that could just be, I don't want to read a whole lot into it because it'd just be that it was not included in there. I'm sure she was still feeling it because she mentions later on talking to Rachel. But yeah, you can kind of almost see her making the connections of, well, okay, if Jacob's not going to love me, that's okay because I have God loving me. And so just taking heart in that emotional connection, allow it to drive you to God.
Yeah, and I don't think we should have our emotions run wild.
Yeah.
That's wrong. We should not be completely disconnected in the sense that we're apathetic, because that would, like you said, that would divorce the reality of these are real people and not just some story somebody made up. But at the same time, I think what we recognize there is that regardless of how you come to the text, regardless of how you come to this narrative, like God is actually able to overcome whatever misgivings we may have about what the meaning is or how we misunderstand it. He's able to overcome all those things through his Spirit and through proper reading, and us actually with a level headedness coming to the text, like we're actually able to get something out of this, because I think I might be wrong here and just kind of overstepping my bounds and like speaking for everyone and saying, but like, man, if we read this story as though there is a moral for us to follow, you're going to be lacking in having a moral to follow at the end of this for most of us, right? We're going to look at like, am I supposed to deceive? Am I supposed to name my kids in this way that's kind of, passive aggressive? Like, what am I supposed to do? I think if you land on a moral to emulate at the end, it's to trust God, which is where we eventually see Leah at least at points, but that's not the whole story. So emotions are involved, but it's not the ruling characteristic. That's not the final word. God and how he is using these things is the final word.
And I think it's a good thing to remember that God gave us emotions. And in general, he gave women more emotions, or at least made us somewhat more emotional. And for a long time, especially when we were first, married, it just like, that seemed like a negative. I'm hyper emotional. I cry all the time. I get super upset over everything. And that seemed like, why am I this way? Like, that's a bad thing. Why can't I be, or at least seem detached, mm-hmm. right? But God gave us these emotions for a reason. And he made women to, feel more motherly. And that's mm-hmm. not always the case. But so if you don't feel that way, you're not broken necessarily. But like in general, that's kind of what he's done. And so I think it's just kind of interesting. We're talking about women of the Bible, and as a woman reading this story, I'm able to connect with it in a way mm-hmm. that maybe some men aren't able to do quite as well. And so God has blessed me in that, he's giving me these emotions. It's the way to connect in order to connect to him through my emotions as well. Reminding, that emotions shouldn't drive our actions, but they should drive us to God. And mm-hmm. so everything that God has given us that is like him, right? Because God has emotions. Right. And so we use those to drive us back to him instead of just focusing on ourselves.
All right, so final parting shot. What is one thing that you failed to mention earlier, or maybe it's like if you're a man reading this story and you feel disconnected to it, what advice would you give from a feminine perspective? Your final parting shot, what would you want to add in there?
It's okay to cry.
It's okay to cry, guys.
Okay
it really is. You should cry a little bit.
It feels good sometimes. No, I don't know. Like, I think there are times when we read it and we're like, okay, it's just a story. And there are times that we read it and God really catches our attention. But don't assume, just because you've never connected to it before, that God's not going to continue to use it this next time. Because, God gives us his word, and it's living and it's active, and it affects us different ways every time. And so just being open to that. Don't run away from it like I would do, because it makes me feel all the feels, right? It's my least favorite story because I don't like how I feel after I read it. But, allow that to happen, and then allow it to carry to the logical conclusion, which is to drive you to God. So I don't know if I have any good advice. Still not my favorite story.
I was about to say, here's the last question. Now that we've had this public conversation and it is of record, it's now no longer your least favorite story, right?
Well, I will admit, I'm reading through the Bible in a year at this point, and there are some way weirder, way harder stories, and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but this has been bumped up a little bit, I guess.
Okay, hey, I'll take it. I think it's beneficial. Rock on. Anything else you want to say? Compliments about me and how I'm a great husband.
You are
a great father,
a great husband, a great father.
You're welcome.
And I want some chocolate after this.
We can make that happen.
Okay.
Make that happen. Rock on. Well, since we don't really have anything else that we want to add, I just want to say thank you to Kacie for joining us. This has been super beneficial. Hopefully everyone else who's watching this or listening to it after the fact is going to find it beneficial. Hang around here for the rest of the video. There's going to be about 3 or 4 minutes after this when I'm going to recap this conversation and give us some of our discussion questions. But other than that, I just want to say thank you for joining us. Thank you, Kacie, for being here. We'll go get ice cream after this.
Yay.
With the girls. We'll make it worth our while. So hopefully you found benefit in this, and we want to end like we normally do, and that's with our benediction of sorts and saying, do good and don't sin. All right, guys. Hey, I just want to go ahead and wrap up session 3's video on Leah and Rachel and just say thank you again to my wife, Kacie. I think she did an excellent job of wrapping up a lot of the stuff that we talked about. I do want to say that I want to just draw your attention to all of the discussion questions that we have in the video description down below. There's about 10 of them in there. There's actually a couple more when they are paired together, but I want to draw your attention mainly to 2 of those, and it's the 5th question and the 8th question. And I think Kacie did an excellent job of really talking about Leah and Rachel and how there's this emotional connectedness in the story, and then we should feel some of that. And I really want us to pay attention to that. That 5th question reads, Leah and Rachel sought their value and affirmation through being mothers. In what ways do we seek affirmation? From things that are to our detriment, or some of the other, combination of that. I want you guys to discuss what that would mean for us in our context, because I'm pretty sure that most of us have experienced that in some way. So I want you guys to take some time and actually think about those things. The 8th question, I think, is one of those ones that I'm really asking you to be vulnerable. I'm asking you to really be honest. And when even Kacie mentioned that there were times that she felt unloved, guys, what would it look like if we had an honest conversation about times maybe we felt unloved? What would we have done to have gained that love and affirmation from somebody else? What would we have traded away? I think that's a valuable conversation for us to have, but I'm asking for some vulnerability there. So take some time, consider these questions, think about it, and I just want you to have some good, honest conversation as a result of this. At the end of the day, guys, I want you to know that you can find us easily with all of our social media handles and everything that's down below. All the contact information that we have is easily found there. I want you to know one thing before we end this video. Even if you have felt unloved before, and just in the process of the world and the way that things work, if you felt unloved, I want you to leave this video knowing that you are absolutely loved by God. And we know that because of what Christ has done for us in his death and his resurrection, and that we know that we are loved because he's laid down his life for us. If you want to have a conversation about what that looks like, by all means, talk with one of your Connect group leaders or come talk with me. I'd love to have a chat with you. Guys, I love you, and I look forward to the next time.